The avenue that went dark, Liberty Avenue, died instantly. On that evening, when a heavy, damp November darkness descended upon the city, the avenue was still pulsing with artificial light. Car headlights drew sharp, white lines on the wet asphalt. The windows of high-rise buildings glowed with a yellow, cozy warmth, creating an illusion of unbreakable normalcy. It was the city's collective sigh after a workday, the sound of life filled with the hum of trams, distant sirens, and the background white noise of electricity. The moment the blackout arrived was absolute and dramatic. It began not with a warning, but with a brutal, physical amputation. First, the sound vanished. The hum of refrigerators inside apartments suddenly cut out. The hiss of computers choked. Music playing in a neighboring window was severed mid-note. This acoustic void was the first signal of the catastrophe, the cessation of all mechanisms that sustain modern existence. Then the light. Instantly, thousands of windows went dark. They transformed from glowing squares of comfort into black, blind apertures in a giant, multi-story wall. Liberty Avenue, which just moments ago was an artery of life, turned into a valley between two massive, dark cliffs. The streetlights, another rudiment of a bygone era, fell silent almost simultaneously. The blackness became physical. Thick it pressed against the eyes and swallowed the last reflections of headlights. The few cars still moving now seemed like ghosts crawling along an invisible road. The psychological shock was collective and deafening. The darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was the absence of control. Along with electricity, everything vanished. Warmth in the apartments, heating pumps went silent. Water on the upper floors, supply pumps stopped. And the possibility of communication, cell towers fell mute. The city was thrown back centuries, but with bodies and minds accustomed to absolute convenience. Inside House No. 18, people froze. Their internal reaction was identical. For the first few seconds, the hope that it will come back on now. The next seconds, a physical need to find something solid in this sudden blindness. A hand would reach out for a wall, a table, the edge of furniture, craving proof of one's own presence in reality. The darkness was aggressive. It distorted familiar space. Well-known apartments shrank to the size of small, dangerous caves, full of invisible corners and obstacles. The sharpest feeling was loneliness. Despite the fact that hundreds of people lived in the same house No. 18, each was locked in their own isolated cell of concrete and darkness. The impossibility of communication made even neighbors, people separated by only a single wall, unreachable. Liberty Avenue became a physical metaphor for lost control and collective vulnerability. Now, there was nothing left but to wait and to listen, to hear the heavy, desperate breathing of a city that had gone out. The geometry of fear and candles. After the sudden, absolute amputation of light came the phase of psychological acceptance. This acceptance was a heavy, physical realization that the electricity would not return in 5 minutes. The darkness was not a temporary error, it was a new, aggressive state of being. Inside every apartment of House No. 18, a microscopic drama of transformation unfolded, the turning of a cozy, familiar home into a cold, hostile space. Darkness seized command over sensory perception. Eyes accustomed to an abundance of light became useless, giving way to hearing and touch. Acoustic amplification. The external hum of the city vanished, replaced by an amplified internal acoustic. One's own breathing and heartbeat grew sharply louder. Every step on the floor felt like a seismic jolt, and most terrifying of all, the sound of one's own thoughts, which in the silence became unbearably loud and anxious. Olfactory anxiety. The apartment began to smell different. Familiar scents of food and cleanliness were replaced by the smell of cold, and the dust kicked up by cautious movements. In the dark, the sense of smell sharpened, turning every unfamiliar aroma into a potential signal of danger. The geometry of fear. The familiar geometry of the apartment's sharp corners, straight lines was destroyed. Everything became rounded, indefinite. Furniture was no longer a collection of comfortable objects, but treacherous obstacles. Every step was a careful, semi-blind act that strained both muscle and mind. The primary emotion was fear of the invisible, The darkness turned even one's own home into an enemy. In response to the absolute dark, the need for an artifact of light arose. That artifact was the candle. The candle, waxy, thin, unstable, was the most ancient and fragile symbol of the human struggle against chaos. The ritual of lighting. The process of lighting a candle was deeply ritualistic. The rustle of a match, the brief scent of sulfur, and a sudden, tiny explosion of light. This light was so precious that it demanded full attention and concentration. The golden dome. A candle did not illuminate the apartment, it created a small, golden dome of light with a radius of 1 meter. This was the only space where geometry was restored, where faces became visible and familiar again. Everything beyond this dome remained hostile and unknown. The economy of the candle. The candle became an object of absolute economy. Its burning was a sacred act accompanied by constant anxiety. How much of it is left? To burn a candle was to burn time and hope. Therefore, it was used only for critical tasks, searching for items, eating, or a brief session of reading. The blackout instantly overturned the value system. Things that were expensive yesterday, technology, aesthetics, became useless junk. Basic functions and physical survival took center stage. Water and heat. Water in canisters and blankets were the new currency, the new assets. The realization that water would not reach the top floors created a specific anxiety among the residents of the upper levels. Every drop was accounted for. The threat of stasis. The main fear was heat. If the warmth finally left the walls of the house, it would be impossible to bring it back. The apartment would become a stone cave. Cold became time slipping away. A solution had to be found before a thermodynamic catastrophe began. Isolation and conspiracy. The candle created another psychological problem. Its light could be seen from the outside. This led to a subconscious demand for conspiracy. Light was proof of a resource, and a resource invited envy and attention. People instinctively hid from windows, intensifying their isolation. On this first night on Liberty Avenue, human consciousness was rebooted. The world became primitive and cruel, but honest. Where there had been light and society, there remained only darkness and the lonely, fragile flame of a candle. House No. 18. Collective silence. Following the acoustic and luminous collapse came the hour of realizing the collective tragedy. House No. 18. A typical, multi-story box from the Soviet era stood in a new, brutal role. It ceased to be a warehouse for individual apartments and turned into a symbol of disconnectedness and collective silence. House No. 18 was built for maximum efficiency, but not for human connection. In the conditions of a blackout, its construction turned every entrance and every floor into a physical barrier to unification. Thick concrete walls, which in peacetime protected against the noise of neighbors, now encased every family in a hermetic capsule. Cries or pleas for help were doomed to be swallowed by the massive thickness of the material. This architecture insisted on loneliness, absence of motion. Elevators now completely non-functional, black, cold shafts cut off the world above from the world below. Any vertical movement became an act of physical heroism and a drain on precious energy. The communication breach. On the lower floors, one could still catch a weak, fleeting mobile signal to send a battery code. On the middle floors, the connection was intermittent and unreliable. On the upper floors, it didn't exist at all. The house was divided into levels of informational freedom. Attempts at communication were rare and cautious. Through gaps in their curtains, people watched their neighbors through the windows, but now these were blind windows. Individual candles. The fragile light of candles flickered in various apartments of House No. 18 with chaotic irregularity. Every lone flame was proof of life, but also a symbol that no one was ready to step out of their golden dome to share resources or vulnerability. Shadows on the walls. Occasionally, the bright but brief light of a flashlight would flare up. It cast fast, nervous shadows on the ceiling of a neighboring apartment. These shadows, the only proof of movement, said nothing of distress or well-being. They only intensified the feeling of being watched and the impossibility of help. The first person who dared to break the collective silence did so unexpectedly and sharply. It was an old man from the 5th floor, who no one knew by name, simply that grandpa from the 5th. In the absolute silence of the night, the sound of the entrance door opening was deafening and frightening. It rang out like a gunshot, interrupting the collective slumber. The creak of hinges. The door was old and ungreased. Its long, creaking groan crossed Svoboda Avenue and echoed back into every apartment. Residents froze, listening to this intrusive sound. Someone had dared to leave their shelter. The rustle of footsteps. A slow, heavy rustle of steps on the cracked asphalt in front of the entrance followed. It was so slow that it seemed like the sound of time itself moving in the darkness. Residents watched him from behind curtains, not even lighting a candle for fear of attracting attention. The old man reached the middle of the courtyard and stopped. His body was a black dot against the gloom of the avenue. And then, he screamed. A wordless cry. It was not a coherent cry for help, but a pure, primal release of despair. A sound filled with cold, fear, and a sense of absolute abandonment. It was a cry against the geometry of fear. The echoed response. His scream struck the walls of House No. 18 and neighboring buildings, turning into a fading echo. It was a collective admission of horror. And the most terrifying part, no one answered. Not a single person turned on a light or shouted back. Everyone was locked inside their shell, paralyzed by fear and the lack of a way to help safely. The return. The old man stood motionless for another minute, then turned and slowly walked back. The creak of the door closed this monologue. The collective silence was restored. But it was heavier now, filled with guilt and the realization of mutual isolation. The episode with the scream left a heavy residue. It showed every resident of House No. 18 their weakest point, the inability for a swift, collective reaction. Neighbors were atomized. Their entire previous lives had been directed toward individualism and minimal interference in others' affairs. The blackout reinforced this survival protocol. One's own children. The main priority was saving one's own family. Helping a neighbor meant putting your own at risk. The risk of using up a candle. The risk of wasting precious battery life. The risk of attracting outside attention. Resource division. A shadow fell over the topic of resources. No one knew who had how many candles, food, or water. This uncertainty bred mistrust and a desire to hide assets even from the closest neighbor. The empty stairwell. The stairwell, a common space, became a zone of high anxiety. Any movement on the stairs was interpreted as a potential threat. Someone is going up. Why? Instead of becoming a meeting place, the stairwell became a physical border between hostile cells. The collective silence was filled with unspoken questions, hanging in the cold air of House No. 18. How are the heavens dwellers? The question regarding the elderly on the top floors, the most vulnerable and isolated. They had no water. It was hard for them to descend. But how could they be helped without breaking the general secrecy or wasting energy? Where can I charge a phone? The question of connection, the only thread linking the house to the outside world. Someone knows of a charging spot, a pavilion, a store, but no one wants to share that information. It is too valuable. What will happen to the heat? The question of the time frame. Everyone understood that time was running out and the cold would eventually force the house to act. But no one knew when the point of no return would be reached. On this cold night, House No. 18 was a fully autonomous system, a system that didn't work. The collective silence was heavy and binding. But it was precisely this silence that was setting the stage for a new sound. The sound of a generator that could pierce through this concrete wall of isolation. The vertical world. House No. 18 turned into a frozen ship, a vertical sarcophagus where horizontal links were severed. By the collective silence, and vertical movement had become impossible. With the elevators out, the house divided into 4 survival zones, each with its own protocol and physical laws. Height became a critical parameter. The higher up, the fewer the resources and the greater the risks. The stairs, previously unnoticed architectural elements, now became an insurmountable barrier. Zone I. The privileged underworld. Floors 13. Accessibility. Maximum. Residents of this zone could quickly step outside to water sources, if any existed, to places with potential signal, and to any external movement. Resource balance. Water could still arrive via gravity or at minimum pressure. Their tragedy was primarily one of light and heat, but not life-critical in terms of water. Psychology. Cautious egoism. Their main task was to preserve their resources and not attract the attention of the upper floors. They became unintentional guardians of gasoline and water for the whole house. Zone E. Neutral territory, floors 46. Accessibility. Moderate. Ascending and descending was still possible for a healthy person, but required planning and a drain on strength. These were floors of active movement in peacetime. Now they became a zone of continuous doubt. Is it worth the risk to go out? Resource balance. Water was completely gone. The need to carry water by hand made every trip down and up equal to a small expedition. Psychology. Cautious tension. They felt like a buffer separated from the vulnerability of the top, yet deprived of the privileges of the bottom. Their fear was purely physical, the fear of physical exhaustion. Zone E. The level of alienation, floors 710. Accessibility. Critical. Ascending with water became a feat that only the strongest family members could perform. Most residents were locked inside. Leaving was equal to losing energy that couldn't be replenished. Resource balance. Total dependence on previously made stockpiles. Every drop of water was accounted for, every movement was calculated. Psychology. Growing isolation. They felt the collective silence thickening around them. They looked down at Svoboda Avenue. From a terrifying height, the city seemed distant, unreachable, and indifferent to them. Zone F. The heavens dwellers, floors 11-14. Accessibility. Impossible. This is a zone of absolute imprisonment. To descend for water is a one-way trip. Resource balance. Critical. Life depends on exactly how many liters of water were drawn the last time the taps worked. The countdown is measured in hours and no one knows how long this will last. Psychology. Despair and stoicism. These are people who have accepted their fate. They hope only for a miracle and their own will to survive. They are the most vulnerable part of society, abandoned to the mercy of concrete and altitude. The elevator, once a symbol of comfort and vertical mobility, has become a cold, black shaft of horror. The walls of the house are pierced by this well of nothingness. Inside the shaft, a supernatural silence reigns. There is no movement, only a black void that swallows sound. Echoes of screams. In the first hour of the blackout, desperate cries were heard from people trapped inside. These cries quickly faded, forcing the residents of House No. 18 into a terrified silence. Now the shaft emits only the lonely creak of a cable in the wind, a reminder of captivity. The smell of oil. A faint scent of congealed oil and cold rises from the shaft. This smell is the aroma of technical defeat. Human engineering has surrendered to circumstances. The stairs, the only remaining path, have become a physical barrier and a social filter. The geometry of exhaustion. Every step is an obstacle, multiplied by the weight of water or food. The way up is an act of depletion, stripping away the strength necessary for survival. The invisible border. Residents of different floors avoid encounters on the stairs. An encounter implies the need for communication, and communication could betray information about resources and plans. The stairs are a route for lonely, secretive travelers. The heavens dwellers, residents of Zone F, floors 11-14, mostly elderly people and families with small children, have become the greatest victims of this vertical geography. Their main enemy is dehydration. In peacetime, they valued the view from above and the clean air. Now, they pay for it with an absolute dependence on water reserves. Depletion of extreme measures. Every desperate measure has been tried: melting snow on balconies, if there is any. Using water from toilet tanks, grey water. These actions are humiliating and underscore their desperate situation. Sensory isolation. They hear the hums of war more faintly, but the heat leaves their apartments faster. Their world has shrunk to the size of a single room, lit by a single candle. They can only stare at the extinguished Svoboda Avenue and wait. The psychology of the heavens dwellers is complex. They must fight not only the cold but the feeling of being abandoned. Moral choice. How do you ask for help? Screaming is ineffective and shows weakness. One must turn to the neighbors below, but that means breaking the collective silence and forcing someone else to bear the burden of the climb. Pride struggles with the need for survival. The last artifact. Their last hope is mobile phones with critically low charges. They spend precious percentage points trying to send a single word help, which hangs in the dead battery code due to the lack of network at such heights. The vertical world of House No. 18 is now defined not by address, but by crisis, a crisis that can only be resolved by physical strength and a new, powerful technology capable of uniting these divided zones and piercing the collective silence. The battery code, if the power outage, was a physical amputation of the city's body. The loss of communication was a psychological amputation of its consciousness. In the vertical world, where people are imprisoned in concrete capsules, the mobile phone has transformed from a device of convenience into the single, fragile thread connecting the residents of House No. 18 to hope for the future and knowledge of the present. The phone immediately shifted status. It stopped being a noisy, constantly vibrating source of distraction. Now, it is a sacred relic, held in the hands with extreme caution and reverence. The absence of sound is its defining characteristic. Number notifications, no calls, no music. If the phone makes a sound at all, it is either an occasional, anxious beep about a low battery or a brief, gasping tone indicating that someone managed to break through the dead network. Vibration as a miracle. In the first hours of the blackouts, when the network still pulsed weakly, a random vibration of the phone felt like a physical shock, proof that the outside world still existed. However, this shock quickly turned into a threat. Every vibration consumed a critical percentage of charge. Darkness as protection. The screen is mostly dark. Turning the screen on even for a second is an act of wastefulness. It has become an indicator for the necessity of action, rather than a background element of life. People's eyes have begun to adjust to the darkness to avoid wasting charge on artificial light. The rules for handling a phone are strict and universal for all of House No. 18, though they are written nowhere. The cold guardian. The phone is kept in the coldest place in the apartment, often by the window, or inside the refrigerator if it is cold enough. This is an instinctive understanding that cold slows battery discharge, extending its life by a few hours. The ban on games. Any apps not related to critical information are strictly prohibited. The phone is intended only for checking news and sending the battery code. A short, encrypted message to loved ones, see below. Flight mode only. The phone remains constantly in airplane mode, flight mode. Searching for a network. The most energy-intensive action is impermissible. The network is turned on for 30 seconds and immediately turned off after a data transfer attempt. The lives of House No. 18's residents are now measured, not in hours and days, but in the remaining battery charge percentages. Every percent is a unit of time, a unit of information, and a unit of hope. The charge level determines a person's psychological state. Above 50%. Relative calm. The person feels they have the right to 2 or 3 news checks and a few sent messages. This is the luxury zone. 30%, 50%. Tension. Every check must be justified. The hunt for a weak signal begins. Conversation with loved ones is necessary, but extremely brief and laconic. 10%, 30%. Crisis. The phone moves to nuclear briefcase status. It is turned on only in case of absolute necessity. Sirens. Information about water. No attempts at outgoing communication, only receiving information. Below 10%. Despair. The phone is turned off. It is kept in the cold to preserve its life for a single, final call in the event of a life-threatening emergency. A person in this zone becomes the most isolated and vulnerable. Because charge and time are under strict accounting, the residents of House No. 18 quickly developed the battery code, a system of ultra-short messages for loved ones located outside the city. 0. battery nearly empty, alive, turning off, waiting. The shortest and most alarming message. It signaled that the person was entering silence mode and would be unreachable for an indefinite time. 1. Everything is fine. Water, heat available. Continuing to hold on. A standard message requiring minimum traffic and battery. To dash, help needed. Cold, urgent need for water. A critically important message sent only if the situation shifted into the risk zone. Sending such a code required incredible discipline, turning the phone on from airplane mode, opening the app, typing a single character, hitting send, and immediately killing the screen and airplane mode. This took no more than 20 seconds and was considered the most efficient way to use the charge. Since centralized communication was non-existent, connection became a matter of geography and chance. Inside House No. 18, a silent struggle unfolded for access to signal hotspots. The upper floors, the heavens dwellers. Their proximity to the sky should have been an advantage. But due to the local tower being down and the metal reinforcement of the building itself, there was no signal. They were doubly isolated, no water and no information. The lower floors, Zone I. A weak signal could be caught right by the window or on the balcony, where the signal from a distant, still functioning tower traveled along the ground. Residents of these floors gained an unexpected advantage, but were forced to break airplane mode and waste charge searching for it. The balcony point. Balconies and kitchens became the primary communication rooms. People stood there in the freezing cold, arms outstretched with their phones, a ritualistic pose of searching for the truth. The most common strategy was instant reception. A person would place their phone on the windowsill in airplane mode and, once every hour or two, quickly toggle the network on, hoping a notification or message had arrived, before immediately shutting it off. Failed attempts. Most often, this led to failure. The message wouldn't arrive in time, and precious charge was lost pointlessly. It was a punishment for impatience. In the darkness, impatience was a mortal sin against the battery code, the pulse of luck. But sometimes in rare moments a message came through. One word, one phrase. It was worth more than 1,000 words in peacetime. It was proof that the world had not ended beyond the concrete box of House No. 18. When the batteries of the entire house began to reach critical levels simultaneously, below 10%, the need for active movement arose. A collective deficit began, a shared shortage of vital energy. It became necessary to head outside into the dangerous, dark Svoboda Avenue to find a functioning generator or a charging station. Lone scouts. The first excursions were solitary. Men and women gathered all the family's phones, packed them into bags, and set off into the nocturnal gloom. Their paths were secret. No one wanted to give away the location of a power source. Information was the most precious resource. Blind hopes. Rumors swirled of a working gas station, a boiler room basement, or a secret point of invincibility in the next district. Every rumor was a dangerous promise that could lead to a trap or a waste of precious time and strength. The price of light. Those who returned spoke of brutal queues, of paying for a charge, often with food or water, and the fact that charging to 100% was impossible, only to 30%, so that there would be enough for everyone. The realization of this shared deficit gradually forced the residents of House No. 18 to overcome the collective silence. The first exchange. Someone was the first to ask a neighbor below if they could take their phone to be charged along with their own. It was a risky act of trust. The neighbor agreed. Thus, a silent charging protocol was born, one person bearing the responsibility for several families. The efficiency of union. Soon, people began collecting phones from all zones of the building, including the most vulnerable, the heavens dwellers, passing them down the stairs. Collective deficit turned into collective efficiency. Charging became centralized, and connection became a common cause. The battery code was not just a system for saving juice. It was the first step toward creating a community, the understanding that survival depends on mutual trust and the ability to share the most valuable resource, life and information. The smell of cold, the cold, was not merely a weather phenomenon. It was a patient, invisible, yet most aggressive enemy of House No. 18. The moment the heating pumps stopped and the radiators went cold, a process of irreversible thermodynamic defeat began. The house began to breathe the temperature of a November street. The cold did not arrive abruptly, it seeped in slowly and methodically, like water into a porous sponge. First came the loss of comfort, then the threat to survival. The cold had its own sound and its own smell, a sharp contrast to the former aromas of warmth and home. Silence was filled with new, disturbing sounds. The creak of concrete. Residents began to hear the building's walls contract and react to the plummeting temperature. The quiet, threatening creak of concrete and wood was like a moan. The house was complaining of the cold, and this amplified human anxiety. Coughs and whispers. Inside the apartments, the number of people coughing and sneezing increased sharply. These sounds, echoing through the silence, became more than symptoms of illness, they were signals of vulnerability. Conversations shrank to whispers, not just for secrecy, but to conserve heat and moisture. Speech required energy. The clatter of dishes, plates and cups, cooling rapidly on tables, took on a specific metallic ring, cold and joyless. Even brief rituals of food preparation were accompanied by this sharp clatter, a reminder that heat vanished instantly. The smell of cold was the most accurate indicator of catastrophe. It was clean, metallic, and biting. The scent of concrete. The walls began to give off the smell of concrete and dust, which in peacetime had been drowned out by the sense of living. This aroma signaled that the house had ceased to be a living space and had returned to its primal, construction site state. The smell of clothes. All clothing, blankets, and even hair became saturated with the cold. It was a faint but constant smell, a symbol that the body's internal temperature was now fighting the external environment without help. The absence of warmth. The most terrifying smell was the absence of the smell of heat. No aroma of hot food, no scent of steaming water, no smell of warmed linens. It was an olfactory void that intensified the psychological discomfort. The concrete walls of House No. 18 turned from protectors into aggressors. They actively sucked the remaining warmth from the apartments and the people within. This drop in temperature led to the appearance of humidity, the primary accelerator of cold. Tears on the glass. The windows began to cry with condensation. These tears on the glass were a reminder that there was no insulation, no protection. A drop of water on the pane was a symbol of human vulnerability. Wet corners. Moisture began to settle in the corners of the apartments, at the furthest points from heat sources, people and candles. These wet, cold corners were markers that the house was surrendering to the frost. The threat of mold. Residents realized the looming threat. Mold. Constant dampness and cold threatened to turn apartments into uninhabitable marshy spaces, forcing people to consider seeking salvation entirely outside the home. People instinctively moved away from the exterior walls. Centralization. Life in the apartments shrank to a single room, the smallest and most internal one, where the cold penetrated slowest. Families huddled together, sharing a single blanket, physical closeness driven by the necessary exchange of body heat. Refuge under the ceiling. Residents of the upper floors faced the fastest loss of heat through the cold roof. They moved to the floor, trying to catch the last bits of warmth rising from the lower stories, or blocked off access to windows entirely. The captivity of warmth, the cold instantly increased the value of any heat source, and created a new collective deficit. Hot water became an absolute luxury. Even a brief hand washing required a colossal expenditure of precious gas or fuel to heat water on the stove. The ritual of the mug. A hot mug of tea or coffee became a psychological act of resistance. Its warmth was a temporary shield against the pervasive cold. This ritual was proof that a human being could still produce heat and comfort. The unity of heat. The warmth from hands pressed against a hot mug was the ultimate form of solace. People would freeze over that mug, allowing the heat to slowly penetrate their palms and then their chests. All strength was thrown into the captivity of heat. Blankets and layers. Clothing ceased to be a choice and became a system. Multiple thin layers of clothing. This was a scientific approach to survival. People slept in hats and gloves. Handmade insulation. Apartments were insulated by hand. All cracks were stuffed with rags. Windows were sealed with tape and covered with heavy blankets. This was a physical declaration of war against the cold. The scent of cold was both a harbinger and a punishment. It told the residents of House No. 18, you have no time. You must find a collective solution and a powerful heat source before the cold breaks the concrete, and your will to live. This crisis inevitably led to the next stage, the appearance of the long-awaited artifact. The artifact with the scent of gasoline. The collective silence of House No. 18 was filled with anxiety. The cold forced the walls to contract, and the absence of the battery code intensified the isolation. The house was on the verge of a thermodynamic catastrophe when the first hint of a solution arrived from the outside. A technological god, clad in red metal and smelling of gasoline. The appearance of the generator was not merely a purchase, it was an act of pure will, carried out by one resident who refused to accept the geometry of fear. This resident, let's call him the engineer, lived on the second floor, Zone I. He was a quiet, inconspicuous man who, in peacetime, dealt with complex electrical circuits and despised the chaos of everyday life. His apartment was filled with tools and logic. Long before the blackout, the engineer began to prepare. This was not panic hoarding, but cold calculation. Gathering accessories. He didn't buy candles, he bought wires with increased cross-sections, reliable adapters, and low viscosity oils. His stockpiles were technical, not domestic. Finding the artifact. The generator, a heavy, red box with metal handles, was found by him at the very start of the autumn crisis. It was bought for a huge sum of money, but not for personal comfort. It was for the task of vertical and horizontal connection. For the entire House No. 18. He understood that survival depended on logic, and logic required electricity. When the blackout hit, the engineer did not join the collective silence. He worked. He was busy designing, calculating power, voltage drops, and minimum fuel consumption. His actions were hyper-disciplined and unnoticed. Solitary installation. He spent several hours on the stairs connecting his apartment to the building's common systems. Using insulated wires, he was preparing an entry point for the energy. In the darkness, these actions were invisible and therefore did not provoke suspicion or envy. The appearance of the generator in the common courtyard of House No. 18 was an act of physical labor and social audacity. The engineer hauled the heavy red box onto the asphalt in front of the entrance. He worked unexpectedly loudly and decisively, shattering the geometry of fear. Visual shock. The generator was a stranger in this darkness. Bright metal, a heavy casing, a set of sensors and levers. It was a technological fetish against the background of frozen concrete. Neighbors from the lower floors only watched this object with caution. It was a source of potential power and noise. The place of power. The engineer installed it on a small concrete block, a symbolic elevation. He wrapped it in a chain and covered it with a tarpaulin, an acknowledgement that this artifact needed protection from human greed. The most important part was the start. It didn't work immediately. The engineer pulled the cord twice, 3 times. This was a tense wait. The entire hope of the house was focused on this moment, the birth of the hum. Finally, it started. A sharp, loud, confident roar of the engine tore through the collective silence of Svoboda Avenue. This was not the anxious rumble of war, but the life-giving hum of technology. Residents of the upper floors, the heavens dwellers, heard it through the thick concrete and froze. The sound was new and promising. The scent of life. Along with the sound came the smell, a pungent, tart aroma of burning gasoline and oil. This smell was dirty, but it was the scent of energy, the scent that life had not stopped. It stood in direct opposition to the clean and threatening scent of cold. The engineer was not a philanthropist, he was a logician. He understood that the generator was a limited resource that had to be distributed according to a strict protocol. He took a flashlight and taped a handwritten notice to the entrance door, the first official message. Inside House No. 18 since the blackout began. It contained 2 points. 1. Condition A energy. The generator runs for 1 hour in the evening from 20 o'clock to 21 o'clock. Power is supplied only to a single outlet in his apartment and only for charging phones and lamps. No heaters. To dock condition E, resource. Contribution to gasoline costs is mandatory and proportional to the floor. No contribution, no access to the socket of freedom. The reaction of House No. 18 was mixed, ranging from awe to hidden hostility. The underworld Zone I. The engineer's neighbors were shocked by the public breach of silence, but glad for the light. They were the first to start collecting money and looking for fuel. Understanding the value of proximity to the artifact. The vertical world zones E and E. Residents descended cautiously, with distrust. They smelled the gasoline and heard the hum. It was inconvenient, but vital. Wires and electricity were stronger than pride. The heavens dwellers, Zone IV. They heard the hum and realized it was their only chance to overcome their vertical world. They had to find someone to carry their phones down. This was the first true act of mutual dependence, and the birth of a community. The artifact with the scent of gasoline was brutal and loud, but it pierced through the concrete and the collective silence. It replaced the fragile light of candles with the stable light of the socket of freedom, beginning the process of restoring human connection inside House No. 18. The sect of electricity. The appearance of the generator in the grimy courtyard of House No. 18 was a technological miracle that, however, immediately gave birth to social chaos. The red artifact with the scent of gasoline became a center of gravity, forcing residents to leave their isolated capsules and gather together. This was not a meeting of a community, but the birth of the sect of electricity, a new social structure based on absolute deficit and shared need. The first reaction to the hum and the light was a mixture of extreme emotions that quickly transformed into a collective ritual. Stage I. Hidden distrust. The first 12 hours. Residents of House No. 18, especially from Zones E and IV, assumed this was a temporary, personal project of the engineer and would soon end. They suspected him of egoism and demanded hidden payments from him. The collective silence was broken by fear, the fear that someone possessed power while they did not. Sensory protocol. Listening to the generator from behind closed doors, without revealing one's presence or interest. Stage E. Realization of value. The first evening, the engineer clearly laid out the ultimatum: 1 hour of light for everyone in exchange for shared gasoline. This rationalized the artifact and made it accessible. Worship began with a practical act. For the first time in days, people could finally recharge their phones. Psychological shift. The hum of the generator ceased to be noise and became a rhythm, the rhythm of reliability and life. Stage E. Fetishization. After 1 week, the generator turned into a physical fetish, a place of power. It was the center of the community, though the community did not yet officially exist. Its red color and the scent of gasoline became sacred attributes signifying survival. The socket of freedom and the ritual of the queue, the nightly queue to the socket of freedom. The engineer's apartment became the primary ritual of the sect. Vertical pilgrimage. Residents from all zones of the house descended the stairs, carrying their precious phones and batteries, their personal relics. This was a physical pilgrimage, piercing through the geometry of fear. Recognition of hierarchy. The queue was the only place where neighbors became visible to one another. For the first time in many days, they saw each other's faces by light, however dim, and exchanged short, restrained phrases. But most importantly, they recognized the power of the engineer and his timers. Collective whispers. No one spoke loudly in the queue. They exchanged information in whispers about movement on the avenue, the price of gasoline, the condition of the heavens dwellers. This whispering became the first act of collective connection, shattering the collective silence. The charging protocol. The new law to manage the queue and the resource. The engineer established the charging protocol, which became the new law of House No. 18. The golden hour. The generator's operating time was sacred, strictly 60 minutes. This was a boundary that could not be crossed, as the engineer calculated fuel with mathematical precision. 15-minute slots. Time was divided into 4 15-minute slots, This would later become the new clock of the house. Each family could plug in their devices for only one slot. Violation meant exclusion from the protocol. Discipline was the price of light. Rejection of luxury. A strict ban on high-consumption appliances, kettles, heaters. Energy was intended only for information and safety, the battery code. Collective fund. Each apartment contributed a fixed daily sum or the equivalent in water, food, to purchase gasoline. Money was collected by the treasurer, another unofficial leader from the lower zoni. Control and accountability. The engineer introduced a system of records, a sheet of paper on the door marking which apartment had paid and had access. This was the first true act of community financial trust in one another, and the recognition of collective ownership over the generator. Friction and resistance. The protocol did not establish peace immediately. Tension and competition were inevitable. Breach of silence. The first complaint came from a resident on the ground floor, Zone I, who felt the hum was too loud and attracted bad attention from the street. He was collectively rebuffed. The hum was the price of light. Hidden hostility. Residents of the upper floors, Zone E, felt envy toward those on the lower floors, Zone I, for their proximity to the socket of freedom and the lesser physical strain of the climb. Attempts at manipulation. Some tried to negotiate with the engineer privately, offering bribes of food or water for an extra 5 minutes of charging. The engineer harshly refused, maintaining the absolute incorruptibility of the protocol. Roles within the sect of electricity. After a week, the new roles became clear. 1. The engineer, supreme leader, responsible for the mechanism and discipline. He bears the weight of the entire system. 2. The treasurer, guardian of the fund and records, the guarantor of financial trust. 3. Vertical couriers, usually young men from Zone E. They voluntarily took on the hardest work, delivering phones and contributions from the heavens dwellers down and back up the stairs. They became the physical bridge of the community. The sect of electricity was socially brutal but vital. It replaced collective silence with a collective rhythm of work and hope. The light in the window, the hum of the generator, was acoustic proof of life. But for the outside world and the residents themselves, the most powerful symbol of victory over the blackout was the light in the window, a single, impenetrable yellow spot on the black facade of Svoboda Avenue. The light emanated from the engineer's window, Zone I. This window became the focus of collective attention and a new social geography. A beacon in the dark. Against the absolute blackness, this square of yellow light seemed unearthly. It was like a signal of hope released into the black void of the universe. It drew the eye and the mind with irresistible force. Shattering secrecy. The light in the window broke the previous protocol of conspiracy, the urge to hide resources. Now, it was an act of necessary openness. The light had to serve the society, so that the society would protect the source of light. The clockwork. The light burned strictly from 20 o'clock to 21 o'clock. Its appearance and disappearance became the only reliable clock for the entire house. People timed their rituals, dinner, the descent, the communication session to its glow. Perspectives on the light, the underworld, Zone I. For them, the light was proof of power and warmth. They were closest to the artifact, but also closest to the conflict over the noise. The vertical world, Zones E and E. For them, the light was the destination of their nightly vertical pilgrimage. It was the promise of exchanging the battery code for recharge. The heavens dwellers, Zone IV. For them, this light was the greatest psychological comfort. From the height of their cold level of alienation, the light in the window seemed like a small but unwavering star on the earth, proof that they were not forgotten. The moral boundary. The light in the window did not limit itself to Hausno. 18. It drew the residents of the extinguished Svoboda Avenue as well. Scouts and hope. In the first days, people from neighboring, completely dark buildings began coming to Hausno. 18. They went toward the light like moths to a flame. They approached the entrance cautiously, reaching out with dead phones pleading in their eyes. Refusal and protection. The engineer and the new couriers were forced to refuse them harshly. The resource was too limited, the fuel fund too fragile. This was a difficult moral choice between broad humanism and the survival of one's own community. The moral border. The light in the window established a clear moral boundary. Freedom was limited by the walls of House No. 18. Outside lay the geometry of fear and the general blackout. Collective action, since the light in the window was a clear signal of a valuable resource. The house was forced to create its own defense system. The sentinels. Residents of the lower floors zone I took on the function of watchmen. They monitored the courtyard during the generator's hour, ready to ward off outsiders or those who might try to steal the artifact with a scent of gasoline. Collective responsibility. This was the first collective function of the building directed outward. In place of collective silence, collective action emerged. The light in the window forged the building together with the harsh logic of self-preservation. The light in the window became the assembly point for a new social routine in House No. 18. It systematized life and 3 key needs. Collective dinner. Many neighbors began to synchronize their cooking with the generator's operation. They used this hour of light not only for charging but to quickly heat food on gas stoves, or simply to illuminate the process. Heat exchange in the entrance. The light and the hum meant that for this hour, the stairwell became warmer and safer. People began to step out onto the landing just to catch a little warmth and share it. The socket of freedom. Inside the engineer's apartment, the most important ritual took place: the exchange of phones. This was the only place where the battery code could be activated without the risk of losing charge. Information center. The engineer and the treasurer became the sole sources of reliable information for the entire house. They passed on news about outage schedules, if any existed, working boiler rooms, and movements on the avenue. The light in the window was more than just illumination. It was a visible sign that the engineer was fulfilling his obligations, that the system was working, and that survival depended on observing the new laws of the community. This light pierced the darkness and the psychological isolation of the people, preparing them for further unification. The acoustics of work. If the light in the window was the visual symbol of hope, the hum of the generator was the acoustic foundation of House No. 18's new existence. This sound, steady, stable, transcended the tyranny of collective silence and replaced it with the strict but life-giving rhythm of technology. This was the acoustics of work, audible proof that the people inside the house controlled at least one aspect of their environment and were actively resisting the darkness and cold. The white noise of survival. From the moment of startup, the generator emitted the same sound, a low, vibrational, confident hum. This sound was not just background, it was a chronometer and a psychological salvation. The collective silence had been menacing. It amplified every random rustle, every creak of concrete, turning normal sounds into danger signals. The hum put an end to that white noise of survival. The generator created a constant white noise that masked the small, anxious sounds within the apartments and the stairwell. This allowed residents to finally relax their hearing and nervous systems at least for 1 hour a day. The rhythm of discipline. The hum was proof of the engineer's discipline and that the charging protocol was being followed. As long as it ran, life was going according to plan. People could psychologically switch from survival in chaos mode to task execution mode. The bass line of the house, the generator, was powerful, and its vibrations traveled through the concrete structures of House No. 18, especially in Zone I. The house's bass line. On the lowest floors, the hum was felt not just with the ears, but with the body as a low, constant bass penetrating through floors and walls. It was a reminder that the house had become a single organism, powered by one mechanical heart. Consolation for the heavens dwellers. For the residents of the upper floors, Zone I, separated by masses of concrete and cold, the hum arrived as a barely perceptible but soothing vibration, a faint but steady pulse of life. Reaching their level of alienation. The hum of work versus the hum of war. The most important function of the acoustics of work was its contrast with the other hum, the hum of war, sirens or explosions they had heard before. The hum of war. Unpredictable, sharp, fading, and panic-inducing. It meant immediate flight, destruction, and mortal danger. Its acoustics were chaotic and irrational. The hum of work generator, absolutely predictable and regular. It ran for exactly 1 hour a day with the same power and tone. It meant order, connection, the battery code, and survival. Its acoustics were logical and reliable. This juxtaposition was the key to the psychological recovery of the residents. They used the sound of the generator as proof that, even amidst external chaos, there was a strict, manageable order within their community. The acoustic shield when the external darkness was occasionally broken by the distant hum of war at night. The presence of the hum of work inside the house served as an acoustic shield. People could focus on the low rumble of the generator, ignoring or dulling the external noise of fear. As long as the generator ran, the house was alive, meaning the protocol and the community existed. The ritual of the end, the hum was inextricably linked to the ritual of the cue, turning it into the most important social act of the day. Startup 20 o'clock. The sound of startup, a few yanks of the cord, and a sharp, confident roar of the engine was the signal for immediate action. Even if a person wasn't looking at a clock, this sound said, "It has begun." The end, 21 o'clock. At the appointed hour, the hum cut out instantly, sharply, as if the house had held its breath and frozen. An absolute, tense silence followed, which was now felt not as a norm, but as a loss. This daily transition from light to dark, from noise to silence, was a difficult psychological trial. Horizontal water, if the lack of electricity, was a technological and social problem. The water supply crisis was a purely physiological ultimatum. Without water, survival is impossible for more than 3 days. When the cold reached a critical point and the pumps could no longer function, the water system of House No. 18 transformed from an artery of life into a dead, freezing skeleton of pipes. The water crisis sharpened all the previous contradictions of the vertical world and brought into focus a new resource, horizontal water, that which could only be obtained at ground level. The collapse of the vertical centralized water supply was the last stronghold of civilization to fall. A high-rise building's water system depends on pumps to push liquid to the upper floors, zones E and if, when the power died, the last of the water pressure was exhausted by the residents of the lower world zone, while it still flowed by gravity. The underworld paradox. Residents of Zone I faced a paradox. They were closest to the main intake and could draw the most water in the first hours, but their pipes cooled the fastest and emptied first once the hope of gravity-fed flow vanished. They were the first who had to go outside for horizontal water. Catastrophe for the heavens dwellers. For the residents of the upper vertical world, Zone IV, the crisis was immediate. Water stopped rising the moment the pumps failed. Their last reserve, the water left in toilet tanks and pipes, was minuscule and used within the first 24 hours for the most urgent needs. The lack of water made using the most critical system, the sewage, impossible. This was a hidden time bomb ticking away inside the building. The ban on flushing, an unspoken and later official ban on flushing toilets, was introduced. Doing so required an immense and unaffordable luxury water in buckets. Instead, bottles and waste containers appeared, which had to be carried outside, a harbinger of a sanitary crisis. The loss of rituals. The hardest losses were the rituals of cleanliness. Taking a shower or even washing one's hair became an unthinkable dream, a luxury requiring dozens of liters of precious liquid and fuel for heating. Hygiene was sacrificed to survival. House No. 18 began to smell not just of the cold, but of unwashed bodies, the sensory experience of cold. Since the vertical world denied them water, residents were forced to turn to the horizontal world, to ground level and the external environment. Horizontal water refers to all water not supplied through the central pipeline. It required physical labor and a venture outside into the geometry of fear. Source I. Basement drainage, technical water. The first sources were the building's technical basements, where small volumes of water always accumulated. Leaks, condensation. This water was dirty and dark, but perfect for the crudest needs, toilets and, crucially, for cooling the generator, which sometimes worked at the limit of its capacity. Source E. the street fountain semi-potable water. Fortunately, near Svoboda Avenue, there was an old municipal fountain that hadn't frozen completely or had a leak. This water was the cleanest available and became the destination for the daily water pilgrimage. Source E. Snow and ice. The reserve. In the freezing conditions, snow and ice on the street were the most reliable reserves, but melting them required a colossal expenditure of thermal energy, gas, coal. Placing it last in the order of priorities, collecting horizontal water was a physically grueling and dangerous act, exiting into the geometry of fear and transporting heavy containers. This work was almost entirely taken on by the residents of the underworld Zonai, as their path was the shortest. Couriers versus Heaven's Dwellers. Water couriers, a new social entity within the community, emerged out of necessity. They bore a massive burden, both physically and morally, while the residents of the vertical worlds Olive were isolated and waited for water from within. The problem of water was a problem of weight and height. Water is heavy. 1 liter equals 1 kilogram. Transporting it to the 10th floor became an act of pure physical strength. Suddenly, all types of water containers gained immense value. Canisters and buckets. The most valuable were 20-liter canisters and sturdy buckets. Their owners, mostly from Zonai, gained an unspoken priority and were vital to the collective water fund. Glass vulnerability. Residents of the upper floors Zonai mostly used light plastic bottles. They were easier to carry up, but required more trips on the stairs to deliver the necessary volume. The sacred vessel. Containers used for drinking water were carefully marked and never used for technical needs, including water for the generator. This was a clear division between the sacred and the profane. Water was stored inside apartments wherever space could be found and where it wasn't too cold, to prevent it from freezing and bursting the container. Centralization in the corner. All water in an apartment was stored in one place, the warmest and most protected corner of the inner room. This spot became a temporary altar where people prayed that the supply would not run out, saving every drop. Residents developed the water code, a strict protocol of conservation. Water after washing hands, if that occurred, was used for washing one's face, then for dishes, and only then went toward technical needs or toilets. Water was a cyclical and enduring value. The horizontal water crisis widened the chasm between the vertical zones of House No. 18, especially between Zone I and Zone IV. Control over access. Zone I residents gained an undeniable monopoly over access to the source, the street fountain, and the most valuable containers. They also controlled technical water for the generator, linking them closely to the engineer and the treasurer. The water tariff. Vertical couriers and Zone I residents introduced an unspoken and later explicit tariff for delivering water upstairs. They didn't demand money, currency had lost its value, but required equivalents in scarce goods: candles, canned food, medicine. The price of 1 bucket of water on the 10th floor could reach 3 cans of food. Residents of the vertical worlds Zone IV were placed in a humiliating position of total dependence on the underworld. The water plea. The Heaven's Dwellers were forced to swallow their pride and beg for water from their lower neighbors. It was degrading, as their survival depended entirely on whether the couriers were willing to carry heavy weights up the cold stairs. The debtor effect. Those who could not pay for delivery found themselves in water debt, a new social obligation that hung heavily over them. This debt could be called in at any moment for collective labor or contributions to the common fund. To avoid total collapse and violence over water, mandatory rules were introduced: the water code, which complemented the charging protocol. Rationing. A strict limit was set on drinking water per day, 1 liter per person. It was a brutal norm, barely enough to sustain life, but it was fair and equal for all zones of the building. Inventory. Couriers and the treasurer conducted regular inventories of drinking water containers in apartments to ensure transparency and prevent hidden hoarding. This was a new invasion of private life, now justified by survival. The sanitary crisis forced the community to draw a clear moral line. 1. Drinking water sacred. Used exclusively for drinking and preparing hot food, which now required careful calculation and mandatory heat treatment boiling. To dot technical water profane, used for the generator, toilets, and rare dishwashing. This water was considered dirty, and its misuse could lead to ostracism. The horizontal water crisis finalized the formation of the new hierarchy of power inside House No. 18. The engineer controlled light, the treasurer controlled finance, and the couriers from Zone I controlled water. For this system to function, only one thing was now required: a connection between all floors, the physical body of the house itself. The stairs. The stairs as coexistence in the old world. The stairs were an emergency exit, a space in between where neighbors occasionally crossed paths on their way to the faster and more comfortable elevator. With the onset of the blackouts and the subsequent crisis, the stairs transformed into the only vital vertical artery of House No. 18, a place of coexistence, conflict, and the discovery of a shared fate. This was the space where the vertical world entered into physical and social contact with the underworld, giving birth to new rituals and a new hierarchy of movement. The stairs in House No. 18 were made of bare concrete, cold and devoid of light. In the darkness, they demanded maximum concentration and adherence to the safety protocol. The trajectory of risk, moving along the stairs, was saturated with risk. Every step without light could be a source of injury. This required a slow, measured pace and mandatory tactile contact, a hand constantly sliding along the cold concrete railing. A person navigated not with their eyes, but through touch and muscle memory. The weight of water. The defining factor was weight, the heaviness of canisters filled with horizontal water and batteries. Ascending to the upper floors became an act not just of physical strain, but of pure will. Couriers distributed the weight with mathematical precision to avoid exhaustion. Use of the candle. Inside the stairwell, candles were used more frequently, but briefly, to illuminate dangerous turns and especially the start of each flight. These short bursts of light were akin to navigational beacons inside a dark shaft. The acoustics of the stairwell. The stairs became the building's new acoustic center, sharply breaking the former collective silence. Creaks and echoes. The squeak of soles on concrete, the clank of canisters against railings, the heavy breathing of those ascending. All of this was amplified many times over and echoed in the vertical shaft. This echo was acoustic proof of movement, proof that the house had not frozen over completely. Identification by sound. Residents quickly learned to identify people by the sound of their footsteps and the pitch of their breathing. A monotonous, heavy climb signaled a water courier. A fast, cautious descent signaled someone rushing to the socket of freedom during the golden hour. The landings. Miniature social zones. The landings on each floor turned into miniature social and economic zones. Meeting point. The landings, especially in zones E and E, became places of temporary heat exchange. People would step out of their cold apartments for a minute to meet a neighbor, exchange a word, and share their body heat or the warmth of a hot mug. The collective window. Small windows on the landings served as a collective light source during the day, and as a reconnaissance window. Neighbors exchanged information about the outside world and monitored the courtyard, where the generator stood. The economics of the landing. The most important economic acts of the community took place on the stairs through a new barter economy. Water trading. The most common exchange was water for candles or batteries. Couriers accepted payment for their labor right there on the landing. It was a fast, brief interaction that didn't require entering someone else's apartment. Hidden exchange. Many deals were clandestine, exchanging medicine, sugar for salt, or clothing. These goods were more valuable than money and changed hands in the dim light of a flashlight. The mission of connection. The stairs were the only tool for sustaining the lives of the most vulnerable, the heavens dwellers. Trust and property. Every act of handing over a phone was an act of absolute trust. The phone, a relic passed into the hands of a stranger. This was a violation of the former geometry of fear, where private property was untouchable. The heavens dwellers were forced to believe that the couriers would return their only connection to the world. Mutual dependence. The stairs proved that the house could not survive as a set of isolated cells. Residents of the lower floors needed contributions from the upper floors for the fuel fund, and the upper floors needed the physical strength of the lower ones for water and light. The battle for fuel, the light in the window, and the hum of the generator were direct results of burning gasoline. Fuel was the lifeblood of House No. 18's new survival system. While water was a problem of logistics and strength, fuel was a problem of economics and external competition. A funding crisis was inevitable. The stockpiles made by the engineer and the treasurer were depleting rapidly. To maintain the golden hour and preserve the community, it was necessary to create a functioning collective economy and conduct the battle for fuel, a dangerous operation to secure gasoline outside the building's safety zone. The fall of currency. The treasurer's initial plan relied on cash, but this plan collapsed as the blackout dragged on. Currency devaluation. Cash became practically useless for buying scarce resources outside of major networks, which themselves had switched to barter or specialized cryptocurrencies. The price of gasoline on the black market skyrocketed to the point of absurdity, requiring payment in gold or equivalent essentials, medicines, tools, fuel as the only capital. Gasoline became the new currency. 1 liter of fuel could be exchanged for a month's supply of tea or a large batch of candles. This gave rise to the iron law. To live, one must burn to burn. One must have value that can be exchanged for fuel. The Collective Survival Fund. The treasurer held a meeting with representatives from all zones and announced the transition to a mandatory collective survival fund. Contributions in kind. Contributions had to be in the form of goods and values that could be bartered for gasoline, canned food, alcohol, rare batteries and the most valuable medical supplies. Cataloging value. The treasurer compiled a barter catalog, a list of items the community was willing to accept in exchange for access to electricity, the battery code, and water, horizontal water. The tariff was strict. The lowest contribution for an hour of phone charging equaled 1 can of beans or 2 candles. Liquidation of assets. Residents of the vertical world's Zoniv were forced to give up the most valuable items from their apartments, jewelry, antiques, or accumulated medicines to pay for access to life. This was an act of forced social equality and the destruction of pride. The fuel sortie. Collecting the funds was only the first step. The main challenge was to physically obtain the gasoline. This task fell to the engineer and his trusted couriers from Zone I. The objective: a single functioning fuel depot on the edge of the district, controlled by private individuals willing to barter for medical supplies. The risk: the route lay through the geometry of fear, cold, dark streets filled with the risk of robbery or military patrols. The target itself, gasoline, was the ultimate lure for danger. The secrecy protocol. The operation was absolutely secret. Not even the residents of House No. 18 were told the date or the route. Only the treasurer and the engineer knew the details to minimize the risk of a leak. Collective silence now served as their shield. The scouts, the engineer, and the couriers had to perform the heaviest psychological work of the entire community, crossing the border of safety. Loneliness. Once on the street, the scouts immediately lost the sense of connection and belonging. They were back in a world of chaos, where their lives could be the price. The double burden. They bore a twofold weight: the physical mass of the barter goods, the accumulated fund on the way there, and the physical weight of the gasoline, the artifact, with the scent of gasoline, on the way back. Gasoline was heavy, pungent, and extremely flammable. Every liter was a danger in itself. The act of exchange was not merely a commercial transaction, but a transformation of values, a direct trade of civilization for survival, life for medicine. At the depot, the owners, hardened, tough men, demanded an immediate exchange for the scarcest goods: medicine, painkillers, antibiotics. These drugs had been collected from the House No. 18 collective fund, mostly from the reserves of the heavens dwellers. The price of light. The engineer bargained not for personal gain, but for the interest of the entire community. The price of every liter of gas was measured in hours of generator runtime and charging portions. The battery code. He knew the lives of all 40 people in the house depended on his toughness. The operation was a success. The fuel supply was replenished for 2 months of generator operation, according to the protocol. The golden hour. A pungent return. The return was the most dangerous moment. The canisters were too heavy, and the scent of fuel drew unwanted attention on the empty streets. The scouts moved slowly, hugging the walls, using their exhaustion and the cold as a shield. Anyone out in such weather looked either insane or desperate, which in itself deterred looters. The new hierarchy, the return of the scouts to House No. 18 was a triumph, but also the beginning of new social tensions. New status. The engineer and the couriers who participated in the operation gained the unspoken status of community heroes, those who had literally risked their lives for the survival of others. Their word in resolving disputes now carried the most weight, solidifying the hierarchy. The battle for fuel finally cemented the hierarchy of power in House No. 18. The engineer technology, the treasurer economics, and the couriers logistics and force. The vertical world Restorative found itself in total submission to this system, where their role was reduced to supplying old assets to the fund. The gasoline was carefully hidden in the deepest, most secure technical section of the basement, far from the apartments and potential fire. The scent of work. Despite all precautions, the air in the stairwell now constantly carried a faint but steady scent of gasoline. The scent of survival. For the residents, this smell was a consolation, proof that the fund was full, that the beacon would burn, and that the community had defeated one of the primary ultimatums of the blackout. The successful resolution of the fuel problem gave House No. 18 the most important thing of all: time. Time to deepen its social structures, strengthen protocols, and prepare for the long winter. And that preparation had to start with fortifying the building's spine. The stairs and their main enemy, the cold. The insulation protocol, the successful battle for fuel, gave the house more than just electricity. It gave them psychological confidence. But the generator's energy was for communication, not heating. The cold remained the sharpest enemy, eroding the walls and exhausting the people. To protect the vertical world from the scent of cold, the community moved to active physical resistance, establishing the insulation protocol, a comprehensive operation to seal the common space. Thermal reconnaissance. The first step was diagnosis. The engineer organized reconnaissance groups who, using manual thermometers and candles, had to identify the main points of heat loss in the stairwell. Zone I main entrance. The old, poorly fitting door was a constant source of icy drafts that immediately rose up the stairs. Zone E elevator shaft. The dead, black shaft acted like a cold flue, sucking residual heat from the lower zones and creating a vertical draft. Zone Z, IV stairwell windows. Small but numerous windows on every landing were either cracked or didn't close tightly. They let in wind and cold directly to the doors of the heavens dwellers. The scouts used ancient methods, a candle flame and a palm. They traced the perimeters of doors and windows to mark every crack. Marking. All critical points of loss were marked with bright tape or colored chalk for the first time. The stairs were covered not in random graffiti, but in scientific data about the cold. The thermal map. The engineer compiled a heat loss map, a graphic representation of the building's vulnerabilities, posted on the entrance door next to the financial reports. This raised awareness of the collective threat. The construction of the shield, the insulation protocol, required the largest volume of joint labor since the blackout began. The stairs turned into a construction site. Material donation. The community created a material fund. All unneeded fabrics, old blankets, scraps of polyethylene, unneeded clothing mostly from Restorative, newspapers, and cardboard were voluntarily donated. Private belongings became a public shield. Craftsmanship. Residents with special skills were drafted: carpenters, plumbers, and women skilled in sewing to create thermal curtains from old blankets. A person's social value became defined by their capacity for physical labor and craft. Sealing the entrance. The main entrance was sealed with a double system, one reinforcing, and stuffing the main door cracks with rags and foam, to creating an internal vestibule of heavy blankets and plastic film to meters from the entrance. This was the heat buffer, isolating the shaft. The elevator shaft was closed on the first floor with a massive cardboard partition, lined with blankets. This stopped the cold flow and returned some heat to the lower zones. Window fortification. The couriers and the youth created the stairwell shield. All windows were covered with cardboard, newspapers, and film, then draped with heavy fabric curtains. The light in the stairwell grew even dimmer, but the heat was preserved. The installation was successfully completed, but the system required maintenance. Thus, the Heat Guardians emerged a new role within the community. The Guardians of Heat Door Regulation. Their primary task was to guard the door, the main enemy of warmth. They stayed in the vestibule and strictly ensured that people entering and exiting immediately closed both doors of the airlock, preventing precious heat from escaping into the street. Draft monitoring. The Guardians periodically ascended the stairs to check the insulation, looking for peeling tape or fallen curtains. They were the orderlies of warmth. Feedback loop. The Guardians served as the first point of contact for complaints about the cold, passing information to the treasurer and the engineer to adjust the protocol. The reinforcement of the rift. The insulation deepened the physical rift between House No. 18 and Svoboda Avenue. Now, entering the entrance was a clear transition from the cold, dead darkness into the warm, albeit dim, space of the community. Psychological comfort. Most importantly, it provided psychological comfort. The temperature inside the stairwell and apartments rose by several degrees, preventing a thermodynamic catastrophe. The scent of cold weakened, and people could afford to lower their guard and remove their heavy outer clothing. Inside their homes, the birth of the Freedom Community. After the insulation protocol was completed, the community was exhausted but united by their shared labor, leading to a new collective ritual: trust. For the first time since the blackout began, people ceased to conserve their internal resources, their strength, for a few hours. After work, they sat in their apartments, enjoying the relative warmth and the knowledge that the entrance doors were sealed and the gasoline was secure. Shared memory. For the first time, all residents shared a positive memory, the memory of working together on the stairs, of creating the thermal airlock, and of the mutual trust required when working on the vulnerable windows of the heavens dwellers. The insulation protocol marked the transition of House No. 18 from the sect of electricity into a true freedom community, a group of people who proved their capacity for self-organization, physical resistance, and mutual aid. Now, this community was ready for the ultimate step: the creation of a shared social space, the place of heat exchange. The place of heat exchange. The success of the insulation protocol and the victory in the battle for fuel provided House No. 18 with stability. This stability allowed the community to move beyond purely utilitarian survival toward creating a social space intended for humanity. That space became the first floor lobby, the area adjacent to the generator and the main entrance. This was the place of heat exchange, a physical and psychological center, where all elements of the freedom community fused into a single whole. Light met darkness, the vertical world met the horizontal, and individual fears dissolved into the collective hum and the shared warmth. The thermal perimeter. Previously, the lobby had been a frozen void that only amplified the cold. Now, it was transformed into a deliberately warmed and cozy refuge. The perimeter of heat. After sealing the entrance, the primary source of heat was not wood-burning stoves, which were banned in common areas due to fire risk, but the intelligent use of technical resources, or residual generator heat. The engineer developed a protocol to use the heat emitted by the generator during its operation. The golden hour. The metal engine structure, surrounded by protective shields, radiated enough energy to significantly raise the temperature within a 5-meter radius. Human concentration. The second and most vital source was the biological heat of 40 people gathered in one place. The heat from human bodies sitting close together created a collective thermal mass that was more effective than any wood boiler and required no fuel, lighting and comfort. Light was a component of the warmth. In addition to the bright light from the generator for charging, a gallery of light was created in the lobby, a collection of candles, oil lamps, and flashlights placed around the perimeter to create a soft, golden glow. This was a visual warmth standing against the black darkness outside. The Table of Unity, a common table composed of several old desks, dragged from abandoned first-floor offices, was set up in the center of the lobby. A symbol of equality, the table was low and unstable, but its presence was a key symbol that people gathered not as individuals in a line, but as a community at a feast. This was the first piece of collective furniture in House No. 18. Blending and bonding. People sat shoulder to shoulder, erasing physical and social boundaries. The vertical world heavens dwellers and the underworld couriers found themselves at the same height for the first time since the crisis began, sitting on benches made of cardboard and crates. The new social geography. The lobby became a living social space where every area played a role in the new hierarchy and culture. The technology corner. The zoner and the generator was the warmest and most powerful. Here sat the engineer and the couriers responsible for the charging protocol. Access here was strictly regulated. Presence was a privilege, a sign of proximity to power and the source of life. The treasurer's corner. The treasurer sat near the Table of Unity, managing the barter catalog and accepting contributions to the collective fund. He was the mediator between technology and the community, the guarantor of justice and order. The hearth of storytelling. This was the area of the table itself, where the ultimate act of humanity occurred, the exchange of words. Here, people became curators of memory, telling stories of what had happened, sharing rumors from the outside brought by the couriers, and, most importantly, sharing memories of their former lives, thereby sustaining the dying culture of the world before the blackout. Laughter as resistance. For the first time in months, collective laughter reappeared in the house, short, tense, but genuine, acting as a psychological resistance against darkness and depression. The barter market and communal kitchen, the place of heat exchange, served as the platform for the barter economy and a new culture of shared consumption. The micro market. The moment the generator's hum began, the lobby turned into a quiet, glowing micro market. Exchanges were fast and precise. Everyone knew the prices from the barter catalog. Objects of desire. Beyond water and fuel, unexpected items became highly valued. Spices, salt, pepper, as symbols of taste and luxury, sugar, as a source of quick energy and pleasure, and needles and thread for repairs and further insulation. The collective kitchen, a small zone for heating water and food on miniature gas burners, which were nearly exhausted, was set up in a corner. This was the only place to get boiling water quickly, without a major waste of resources. The role of hearth keepers. This function was taken on by the oldest residents from Zone E, who could not perform the heavy labor of the couriers or the engineer, but possessed invaluable experience in managing thermal resources. The descent of the heavens dwellers for the residents of the vertical world, Zone IV. Descending the stairs and visiting the place of heat exchange was an act of not just need, but social capitulation and admission that their isolation was over. The bridge of pride. Descending meant a temporary renunciation of status and the acceptance of the underworld's rules. The vertical world was built on distance and independence, but the place of heat exchange demanded proximity and dependence. Psychological unveiling. In this warm, bright spot in the dark, people shed their mental shields. The tension of collective silence was replaced by the exhaustion of socializing, but it was a healthy exhaustion. The exchange of words acted as therapy, the transfer of personal burdens into the shared space. The place of heat exchange became a mirror for the community. Looking at others, people finally realized that their suffering was shared. A woman from the 9th floor saw the courier from the 1st, who had carried her water the day before, and for the first time, they could speak as equal partners in survival. Overcoming alienation. Here, the final overcoming of alienation took place. Isolated cells merged into a single social body. functioning according to strict but humane protocols. The lobby was built not of concrete, but of will, gasoline, fabric, and human warmth. It was proof that, if people are given time and basic resources, their first instinct is not a struggle for scraps, but the creation of a community. But the greatest threat had not vanished in a cold and lack of sanitation. A hidden danger was maturing that could destroy this entire fragile construction. Disease. Harbingers of the pandemic, the community of House No. 18 had successfully overcome the crises of energy, logistics, and cold. The place of heat exchange functioned, the hum of the generator was stable, and gasoline was in reserve. However, the gathered collective thermal mass and social proximity necessary for survival, simultaneously, became the ideal environment for a hidden enemy to multiply. Illness, poor sanitation, lack of running water and sewage issues, vitamin deficiencies, and constant stress layered upon the close interaction in the lobby, triggering a wave of sickness that threatened to annihilate the entire social structure of the community of freedom. The acoustics of illness. The first clear signal of the crisis was the acoustics of illness. If previously a cough was merely accidental background noise, it now took on a collective and alarming character. Rhythmic coughing. Coughing became a rhythmic, persistent sound piercing the collective silence of the night. It was especially loud in the narrow corridors of the stairs, where it amplified with an echo, causing panic among neighbors. Geography of spread. The disease began its spread through the most vulnerable points among the elderly heavens dwellers. Zone IV, whose immunity was exhausted by cold and isolation, and among children from Zone I, who played on the cold stairs and in the lobby. Fear of breathing. People began to fear the shared space. The place of heat exchange transformed from a cozy center into a hearth of potential infection. During the golden hour, people instinctively turned away from each other and spoke even more quietly to avoid exchanging invisible viruses. Secrecy. The appearance of the illness immediately triggered a new form of collective silence. No one wanted to admit to being sick. Illness meant isolation and the loss of access to shared resources, light, water. So people hid their symptoms, which only exacerbated the risk of spread. The pharmacist of light. The crisis forced the community to identify and recognize a new role: the medical specialist. Fortunately, on the 7th floor Zone E lived an elderly woman, a former pharmacist, who also possessed basic medical knowledge. She became the pharmacist of light. Medicine inventory. The pharmacist initiated the fastest and most rigorous inventory within the community, the inventory of medicine. She created a medical fund from the resident supplies, primarily those expensive antibiotics and painkillers that had been bartered for gasoline. Rationing. Medicine became the most scarce and strictly rationed resource. The pharmacist introduced a brutal rationing protocol. No antibiotics in the early stages, only for critical cases, to save the community from total depletion of supplies. Diagnostic ritual. The pharmacist descended to the place of heat exchange only accompanied by a courier, to ensure safety and warmth, and conducted a diagnostic hour. She examined patients by the bright light of a lantern, recording temperatures and symptoms. The quarantine protocol. The pharmacist delivered a harsh verdict: social proximity must cease immediately, and a quarantine protocol must be introduced. Water Protocol 2.0. Mandatory boiling of all drinking water was introduced, along with a strict ban on any use of technical water for hygiene needs. Hygiene was reduced to a minimum, only alcohol rubs, which became even scarcer, and dry washing. Quarantine and isolation. Anyone with a fever was obliged to immediately isolate in their apartment and cease contact with the community until recovery. The quarantine protocol was the heaviest social trial for the community, because it required the abandonment of the place of heat exchange, their most precious new conquest. Punishment by isolation. Isolating the sick was not only a medical act, but a brutal social punishment. The sick person lost access to collective warmth, the socket of freedom, and communication. They returned to the geometry of fear and the cold of their apartment. The sick care service. Couriers were forced to take on the most dangerous work, delivering food, water, and medicine to the sick while following a strict hygiene protocol, and without entering the apartments. It was an act of pure humanity and risk for the common good. Psychological breaking point. Many tried to protest against the quarantine, arguing they needed warmth and light to recover. The community was on the brink of a rift. Personal compassion against collective survival. The engineer's intervention. The engineer intervened, using his authority. He stated that if the survival system, the generator and couriers, were paralyzed by illness, everyone would die. He applied pure survival logic, demanding rigid discipline to preserve the community. Return to rhythm after 2 weeks of strict quarantine and the pharmacist's work. The morbidity curve began to decline. The protocol worked. Return to function. The sick recovered and returned to their roles. The community accepted the illness as a temporary deviation and returned to its rhythm of work. Understanding vulnerability. This crisis taught everyone the main lesson. Their greatest strength, social cohesion and proximity, was also their greatest vulnerability. Survival required a constant balance between social closeness and sanitary distance. After the crisis, the community performed a collective cleansing. The entire lobby and stairs were thoroughly disinfected with alcohol solutions from the fund. It was a ritual of returning to normal life. The place of heat exchange was reopened, but now with stricter rules. People sat in cloth masks and followed a mandatory hand washing protocol before entry. Vertical harmony. After overcoming the medical crisis, the community of House No. 18 reached a state that could be called vertical harmony. All elements of the system from the engineer to the heavens dwellers functioned according to strict, but now absolutely accepted protocols. Former social conflicts were replaced by a rigid, but fair division of labor and resources. House No. 18 ceased to be a random collection of apartments and turned into a single, self-sufficient, mechanically precise organism, working according to a new, common rhythm, a rhythm that challenged the darkness and chaos of Svoboda Avenue. The key aspect of harmony was the absolute synchronization of all 4 zones of the building, through the stairs and the place of heat exchange. Vertical harmony. The social structure zone eyed the underworld, base and power. Residents of this zone fully embraced their role as the logistics center. They controlled the generator, maintained the airlock insulation protocol, and served as the primary carriers of horizontal water. Their work was rough but vital. They earned the absolute trust of the community in managing resources, which became their social currency. Zones E buffer and personnel, connection and labor. These zones became the primary personnel reserve. Residents here took on the bulk of the heavy vertical labor, lifting water to their heights, delivering contributions, and filled key social roles. The apothecary, the treasurer, and the guardians of heat. Zone of the heavens dwellers, asset and purpose. The heavens dwellers ceased to be passive victims. They became the guardians of the fund, their contributions, medicines, valuables, some of which were traded in the battle for fuel, maintained the economic stability of the community. Their vulnerability was their main asset. The necessity of saving them served as a moral purpose for the whole building, preserving its humanity. The synchronized cycles. Life in the house was now perfectly synchronized, own temporal cycles, established by the engineer's protocols. 1. Morning cycle 8 o'clock, vertical water transit, collection of contributions, sanitary rounds, quarantine checks. To daytime cycle 10 o'clock 16 o'clock, horizontal resource searching, fuel, medicine, and trips to the street fountain. 3. Evening cycle 20 o'clock, the golden hour, the light in the window, the hum of the generator, the place of heat exchange, the queue, and the battery code. The day's climax, an act of collective experience, transparency and justice. Public accounting. The treasurer introduced a system of daily accounting on the common table. All incoming contributions and expenditures were publicly marked in chalk on the wall, next to the heat loss map. This eliminated hostility and suspicion. The community court. Disputes were resolved immediately and publicly on the stairs or in the lobby. The decision made by the engineer and treasurer was final and binding. Vertical transfer of trust. Couriers carried water and phones upward, based on a schedule rather than for personal payment. Contributions from the heavens dwellers went to the general fund, replacing financial conflict with a sense of shared duty. The return of the rhythm house No. 18 was prepared for an endless wait. The harmony was so solid that the community began to perceive the external blackouts as a permanent state of the universe. But the central rhythm of the city, silenced for months, unexpectedly restored itself with a force equal to the first blackout. The event occurred deep in the night. The first soundlight, a flash, sharp, white, unnaturally bright light flooded the windows. To eyes accustomed to candles, it was blinding and painful. It shattered the comfortable geometry of fear. The second sound, a sigh, a collective sigh of the city. The hum of refrigerators, the hiss of pipes, the acoustics of normalcy returned all at once. It was deafening and disorienting. The vanishing beacon. Most jarring was the silence of the generator. The engineer instinctively cut the motor as he felt the surge of external power. The hum stopped, its mission complete. The social collapse. The restoration of electricity caused an immediate social collapse. House No. 18 began to dissolve back into isolated cells. The uselessness of leaders. The engineer woke up to find his power gone. His technology was replaced by the state grid. The treasurer was left with a barter catalogue that had lost all value. The stairs were empty once more. The return of egoism. Residents hurried back to their private apartments, to private light, private warmth, and private screens. The social proximity of the lobby was replaced by the comfortable isolation of the pre-blackout era. Forgotten debt. The heavens dwellers no longer needed help. Water flowed upward, elevators moved. Their dependency vanished, and with it, the moral purpose of the community. The hum of silence. The next evening at 20 o'clock, out of habit, a few people came to the lobby. They stood in the harsh, white, uncomfortable light, looking at the empty spot where the generator used to be. Farewell to the artifact. The engineer stood by the red box, wiping it with oil. He said quietly, it fulfilled its duty. The symbol of the beacon. The light in the window no longer burned alone. The entire avenue shone with an indifferent, collective glow. Their own beacon had lost its meaning. Neighbors realized they were becoming strangers again. The legacy of the community, despite the disappearance of the protocols. The collective memory remained. The stairs as a chronicle. Chalk marks remained on the walls, notes about water, schedules, and funds. They weren't painted over. They became silent witnesses to a social feat. Artifact in the closet. The generator was cleaned and hidden in the building's common storage, along with leftover gasoline. It became a shared reserve controlled by the treasurer in case the rhythm ever stopped again. Knowledge of the neighbor. The most important thing remaining was the knowledge of who everyone was. Residents of the underworld now knew exactly where the elderly person lived who had donated medicine, and they knew the man behind the engineer. Anonymous faces had become carriers of stories and functions. 1 week later, Svoboda Avenue returned to its former life. The clang of trams and the glare of neon signs filled the world with excess once again. But the residents of House No. 18 were no longer the same. When someone looked at the lights of the avenue at night, they no longer took them for granted. They saw the collective labor, the fund, the sleepless nights of the couriers, and the hum of the generator. They knew that behind this bright light stood the shadow of their community, which had survived through absolute discipline and self-sacrifice. The light in the window, though extinguished, as a physical beacon, remained in memory, as a symbol of freedom, freedom from fear, and freedom through the community.